Hello, and welcome back to episode 3 of our Out of the Abyss RTDFW recaps series. I am the Dungeon Master, David, the ruler of the Demon Realm, and our players once again are Ellie, Brack, Mallos, Criella, Azrael, and of course Roscoe. All played not in this order because I don't remember what I just said. Remember, I try and do all these in one take. Played by the lovely Ashe, Alex, Chase, Danny, Abby, and Cameron H. Where we last left off, the party had just arrived at the Koatoa city of Bloopledoop, or something along that lines, and they had a rather tense encounter with a head priestess of a being known as Limagoogan, who had been sacrificing blood and shum to the waters of the Dark Lake. And after a battle at the behests of the head priestess's father, who was a head priestess of the main deity of the Koatoa, which is Blibdolpool, the Deep Mother, it was revealed with the death of the head priestess and her sacrifice to Limagoogan that Limagoogan himself, otherwise more colloquially known as Demogorgon, the Prince of Demons, emerged from the Underdark's waters of the Dark Lake and decided to raze the city to the ground. Escaping with the new mysterious woman Griselia, a strangely otherworldly beauty, and they didn't really have time to question much. The party retreated back to their boat and started the long sail across the waters over to the dark dwarf city of Graxlin, a city of smog and ash that, not to be confused with a player Ashe, that was recommended begrudgingly by Seraph as if a place is needed to rest, even momentarily, that would be a good stop on the way to the Neverlight Grove, a place that he and Stool, the young Myconid Sprout, had been pushing for the party to go to, as it was also on the way to Blingdenstone, the deep gnome city that had a pathway back to the surface out of the horrors of the Underdark. However, before we get too far into our recap and what happens in our next ledge of the Breakfast Club's adventure, let's take a moment to look over some demon facts. So, starting with a crash course on demon kind, demons are half of what are known as fiends in the 5e universe. Now, most people will tell you that. There is also the exception of Yugoloths, but we don't really talk about Yugoloths because Wizards of the Coast have never really expanded upon the lore of Yugoloths, because the Nine Hells, where the devils are, and the Abyss, where the demons are infinitely more interesting for most commonplace players. But if you really need to know what a Yugoloth is, it's basically a fiend for hire. That's a very watered down explanation of it. They live in I believe the lower plane of Gehenna, and not a pleasant place, but it's not as unpleasant as other places such as the Abyss or Pandemonium or the true nightmarish realm that is Carceri. But demons at their whole are a rather unruly bunch. They have no set guidelines for rules in the most part, except for what is established by whichever demon lord or higher controls the respective circle or layer of the Abyss that you are residing in. Now, the Abyss itself is a realm of nightmares, horrifying creatures. If you've ever had a dream about being chased by anything, chances are the Abyss has something in there that is even pretty similar to that. we've never been introduced to it, but I'm sure that there's a demon lord of clowns, or a demon lord of coming to school late. There's a demon lord for everything, because the abyss is infinite. Now, the abyss itself is actually the dream nightmare of a eldritch being that's older than the universe. Basically, imagine Galactus on steroids, a creature known as Tharizdun. Tharizdun, in his essence, is a entity of writhing mass and madness. If anyone watched the second campaign of Critical Role, there was a decent section of the chapter that was devoted to Tharizdun and his presence in that story. And he's typically what people consider when they think about the worst things that reside in the Abyss. But aside from certain beings like Pazuzu or Pale Death, or Pale Night, I think it's Pale Night, beings that would melt reality, if they were to ever to show up on the prime material plane, the Demon Lords are the closest thing possible to not melting reality, but still turning reality into the Abyss. Because a very bad thing that happens in demonic incursions is if a single rift is open, then demons start to pour out. And then as negativity builds up, that rift gets wider and wider and wider until the rift becomes wide enough for whichever demon lord that rift entered into to come on through, and then eventually that plane of existence that the rift connected to just becomes another infinite layer of the abyss. Demons don't fuck around. They have a very almost infectious-like parasitism of reality, which is one of the reasons why, if you're going to make a deal with either a devil or a demon, try and do it with a devil, because devils have a code of rules. You're damned either way, no pun intended, but you're probably going to be in a better place working with devils than working with demons, as you can try and set up contracts with both, but contracts with the devil are a little bit more, shall we say, they're going to abide by that rather than just eat your soul. Because souls aren't a thing that demons look for. Demons and devils are arch nemesis, both on their respective planes of the lower circles of the multiverse, multiplanar. It's this whole world tree. If anyone has ever looked in the back of their player's handbook, they can see there's a bunch of circles outside of the prime material plane, and basically everything on the bottom row is not very fun. Kind of similar to the Dark Multiverse from DC, if anyone has ever heard that story. But I digress. So demons in themselves are ruled in each layer by a entity, and demon lords are the top of the food chain for whatever layer that they are, and there are several layers, and thus there are several demon lords. There is Demogorgon, who's the prince of demons. There's Orcus, the demon lord of undeath. There's the demon lord of the hunt. There's the demon lord of desire, of lies, of fungus, of oozes, of you think of something, and again, there's going to be something of that aspect. And they have a fairly loose hierarchy in where basically the thing you need to realize about demons is, more often than not, it's might is right for demons. The reason Demogorgon is the prince of demons is because he can just overwhelm everything with his power. He is a big honking monkey. He is not the creature from Stranger Things. He is his own entity. He's not a bunch of pale men. And he is as strong as an ancient dragon, the strongest of the ancient dragons, being reds and golds. He is a horrifying amalgamation of a T-Rex's feet, tentacle arms, and a baboon's torso with two snarling heads, heads known as Amawiel and Hadorathiath. I'm probably butchering those names horribly, but if I were to say them properly, it would probably summon him. Those names are pulled from Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes that had a very beefy section about demon lore when it was released a couple of years ago. And in Demogorgon's section, he prefers to meet every challenge with overwhelming force. He hates life. He wants an empty multiverse of all other creatures, and when everything is finally dust and there's no possible chance of him being betrayed or backstabbed, then he'll finally be happy. And in that brief moment where he'll be happy, his two heads will look at each other and then eat their own tail, leaving a desolate universe devoid of life and activity. He's not a great guy. He also has a lot of interesting lore in the facts that even certain aspects of his possibly divine memorabilia, more likely arcane, if you even see a symbol of his, you start to go crazy. And this has affected very famous wizards and magical beings in the 5e universe, such as the time when Mordenkainen thought it would be a good idea to look at Demogorgon's symbol through a mirror, because he was like, oh, it's a mirror, it won't affect me the same way. Turns out it affected him stronger, and the wizard Rari, who people may know from the 5th level spell Rari's Telepathic Bond, saved him at the cost of Rari's own sanity, allegedly. It's very interesting lore in terms of just how much Demogorgon's presence can actively screw up the multiverse. And you see that in Out of the Abyss with various creatures that emerge. There will be two-headed creatures, such as two-headed giants, two-headed, not dragons, that's a different thing, but two-headed sea creatures, two-headed aberrations, basic, and the early parts of the story as well hint to Demogorgon's presence, as it is encouraged for most dungeon masters to have Demogorgon as the main adversary of the story. Mild spoiler warning: he isn't the demon lord who is the adversary in this story, or at least not the main adversary. But he was still a significant threat, and in those early days, as the Breakfast Club was approaching the city of the Koatoa, they did have various dreams of orange glowing eyes looking at them in the dark, accompanied by the roars of beasts such as him, which would be deafening and horrifying, to the point where even looking at him in-game, there is a chance that will cause madness, as defined in a section of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which, in certain circumstances, can range from you paralyzed from fear, your mind breaks a little, you have disadvantage on certain saves, and if you keep accumulating trauma and madness, it gets to longer versions and then indefinite versions. It's a very, very scary time when you're dealing with madness, and it's a telltale sign that he inflicts it just by being in an area. But as the Breakfast Club proceeded onwards, oh, and I should mention, this is Demogorgon, the two-headed monkey that destroys the world, not the starfish monster from Stranger Things. It's very important. One of those is the right image, the other one is the wrong image. Okay, moving on. So, back to the Breakfast Club. Oh. As previously stated, Mallos is the intellectual head of the Breakfast Club, and one of the benefits of that is that more often than not, if there's an Arcana check to be made or a History check, Mallos can typically make them, given that he also has the recently bullshit Sorcerer power of just spending a sorcery point to reroll any ability checks. Slight tangent, but when Danny was pitching me the idea of playing a modified Draconic Sorcerer, I stated that yes, you can get your sorcery points back on a short rest, but there would be a caveat that in terms of spell slot generation, that wouldn't be viable. So he actually, I believe, has 3 pools where he has his unedited, his spent, and then his regained via short rest rather than regained via long rest. It's more work for Danny, but I think he's genuinely had a lot of fun playing Mallos in the version that he's been playing. So that's not a huge worry that he's, not having a good time. I'm sure he is. The one thing that he does have a bad time with is the fact that sorcerers do not get ritual casting. So as he is the only member of the party with Identify, it gets kind of silly when he says, okay, I've got to use my spell slot again. So anytime they run into multiple magical items at once, you can hear a little bit of Danny's sanity cracking, which means that I'm doing my job correctly. But thanks to Mallos' efforts, the party vaguely understood that the reason that Demogorgon was such hot shit is that his title is the Prince of Demons, which basically means that he is the current highest echelon among the demon lords that aren't eldritch evils that nobody messes with in the first place and don't mess with the rest of humanity. That's also due to the fact that there's a lot more lore for those characters that has never been gotten into in 5e, because that would complicate the narrative far too much in terms of demonic lore, because when you have something in the same realm as Baphomet, the demon lord of beasts, or the demon king of beasts, demon lord of beasts, I believe is his title. When you have Baphomet living in the same plane of existence as Pale Knight, a lady dressed in a white bridal outfit who is just madness and nightmares incarnate, that complicates the narrative and also belittles the King of Beasts, which you don't want to do if you're trying to make Baphomet one of the possible antagonists of the story, which he very possibly can be, because in Out of the Abyss there are quite a few stat blocks available for demon lords and their ways that they can be worked into the story. But thankfully, due to Mallos' knowledge, he managed to put together that Demogorgon was here. That meant that others could be here just via logical deduction. And he also remembered some of the other names, such as Orcus, the Demon Lord of the Undead, Grazitz, who has a very silly spelled name, but everyone just kind of calls him Gratz, the Demon Lord of Desires, and several other horrifying creatures. So it wasn't a very good time for the Breakfast Club in the most part. But as they sailed away from the wasteful devastation of Blackblooded, the Koatoa city, and again, that's probably not how you pronounce it, they discovered that the mysterious woman that they had succeeded in rescuing had several abilities that didn't fall under the common instances of normal magic. She seemed to be able to heal her wounds once they had freed her from her bindings, and when they restored her to consciousness, she stated that she showed the ability to cast very high-level spells, higher than the party was capable of at that time. Spells such as Flame Strike and other holy/fiery attacks, and just sheer devastation. But the most interesting aspect about her character seemed to be that there was a rather unique runic crest that was carved into the flesh of her back, which did not heal as her other wounds did. And it was of various elvish/abyssal writings that the party itself didn't fully comprehend. Unfortunately, the party has always been lacking in the divine aspect. They do not have any clerics, and though Brack is a divine caster, being a druid, Brack's area of specialties is more shape-shifting until he changed, and he is now a very fiery individual. Fire and life is the sort of motif of the Circle of Wildfire. And the character herself was a very, I don't want to boast and say intriguing, but she was definitely a question mark for the party. She managed to have a sense of soft-spokenness. She was very polite. She was very kind. The party themselves managed to have a significant, not only attraction, but also affection that they developed for this woman who identified herself as Grisellia. It was just one of those personalities where the entirety of the world kind of shifts focus onto this one individual. They didn't know if she was a fae, they didn't know if she was a celestial. There was something about her that was just a puzzle that they needed to crack. And they tried various methods. One of the most notable instances was when Mallos tried a Detect Thoughts spell on Grisellia, trying to peer deeper into her mind, and a mysterious voice not only scolded him for the effort, but knocked him back psychically, much to the surprise of everyone, including Grisellia, who swore that she didn't know what the reason was. So the party tended to assume that whatever the crest was, it was also suppressing some sort of aspect of her memory and or personality. So with the rather enigmatic individual now accompanying them, their travels across the waters of the Dark Lake were pretty terrible for the most part. In mechanics, it is a 20-day travel from the Koatoa city to Graxon, which I don't, unless you are a level 6 Elk Totem Barbarian, you're not reducing that travel time, so that's a full 20 days and a full 40 chances for an encounter. Several encounters were terrible, especially given the fact that though they did have a proper boat and it didn't require rowing of a significant amount because it was a dwarvish-made kind of paddle boat, because the dwarves are one of the few people insane enough to brave the Dark Lake on themselves without relying on Koatoa assistance, as many of the drow who go onto the Dark Lake either don't, because why would they? That's crazy. Or they have Koatoa slaves that they just say, hey, you're going to be our... we're going to be Aquaman, and you're going to be our mount for our boats. And if Koatoa refuse, Koatoa die. Because drow are very pleasant individuals. But some of the first encounters while on that 20-day trip really were some of the most enigmatic and... Well, not enigmatic, I just said that word. That's to describe Grisellia. This is what happens when you do these recordings in one take. Very, very dangerous circumstances. One of the most notable examples was the party after, I believe this was about day 6, day 7, a decent ways into their day. The party managed to find a island respite that had clean water and just a chance for them to not be on the boat, because they got real tired real fast of being on that boat. I mean, Ellie didn't, because Ellie's a pirate. But when you're Brack, who prepares a lot of spells for ground-based activity, Alex unfortunately didn't have much opportunity to use a majority of the spells that they had prepared, and then it was this whole big shebang. It caused amusement in the sessions themselves, but at the same time, it was just, I'm sorry, I know you want to use the spells that you prepared, but you're on a boat, and if you do this, you'll probably destroy the boat. But one of the biggest encounters was when they found that island respite, as I was talking about, and they managed to run into a couple of Bahirs, which are severely dangerous. Imagine a, I want to say, take a lizard in your mind, give them 3 extra sets of feet, make it electric blue, and then make it the size of a school bus that can shoot lightning bolts out of their mouths at you. But here are not anything to sneeze at, especially since there's some of the encounters that can come from Xanathar's random encounter table. But there was some fortune from all these terrible encounters, as when they encountered the Bahir, they managed to slay it because they had Azrael and they had Ellie and they had 2 characters who knew Fireball, and the party, bless the hearts of all 6 of my players, but they have always been far more capable than they give themselves credits for. A lesson that they recently got somewhat reinforced, but we'll get to that moment when we get to that. That was a rather large moment. But after handedly taking care of the Bahirs, they did also manage to accumulate quite a decent amount of wealth. And also, because I, again, love player-character merchant relationships, there were more run-ins with Sassafras. He, at various times, made them generous offers, and they took him up on certain things, and they got many upgrades to their weaponry. They got certain upgrades to just general defense. Azrael got magical shielding. I refuse to give him magical plate because I've already done that once before and I'm never doing that again. Which complements his wielding of Dawnbreaker, or Dawnbringer, not Dawnbreaker, Dawnbringer, the sentient light sword that we mentioned in the previous episode. And there was a sense of grim determination that made each session kind of have the feeling of monotony eliminated. Again, the party fell into various roles very handedly. Mallos was, again, sort of the intellectual leader, and he would always be trying to, figure out things about demons, and Brack would always be the light of optimism, which was tempered by Roscoe's very mature patience, and Criella's sense of patience that was constantly strained by Mallos and Ellie, while Azrael just kind of gave a gruff sort of, okay. It's a very fine team that they built themselves up to be. However, unfortunately, as they continued along, tragedy, rather like the Netherese Temple we mentioned last time, reared its ugly face again. So this was not mentioned in the previous episode, but one of the encounters of those early levels and that trip to the Kotoa city was that of imagine a creature about the size of a peanut butter jar, but it's a brain with legs. These things are known as intellect devourers, and they are the brood/puppets of one of the most notoriously evil and vile creatures in all of 5e, known as illithids, or as they are more colloquially feared as, mind flayers. Illithids are a rather mysterious race. It's not exactly clear if they come from the distant future or the distant past. All mortality, for lack of a better word, seems to remember is that illithids are the enemy. It doesn't matter if you're against demons. It doesn't matter if you're against elves. If there's an illithid, that's your enemy until the illithid is taken care of. Then you can get back to your normal race war. By the way, don't do race wars. They're not good. Unless it's an illithid, because mind flayers are the worst. 3 races in particular, and by 3 I mean 1 in mass extension, and then another, were particularly affected by the effects of the illithid, which are the deep dwarves, or the dark dwarves, in canon, were a group of dwarves that were kidnapped by mind flayers and repeatedly psychically tortured and abused until they finally managed to kill their captors. But by the time they got back to the rest of dwarven kind, they were shunned as aberrations of dwarfs, and the leader of the resistance against the illithids swore a oath of betrayal and lack of camaraderie till the end of time with the rest of dwarves, because the rest of the dwarves and the dwarven god of Morden didn't believe them that they had been gone and been tortured. It's a very, very dark, depressing story of the founding of the Dark Dwarf society and culture. And the other race is the almost as feared as illithid, the Githyanki and the Githzerai. The Githyanki are space pirates. There's no better way to say that. Githyanki are essentially just space pirates. They live in what is known as the Astral Sea. They have flying ships that they raid into various other planes of existence to loot for booty and slaves, or sometimes slave booty. And then they go back to where they came from, which is a city that is built into the body of a dead god, and their society is ruled by a centuries, if not thousands of year-old Lich Queen, who did something with the founder of the Gith race. No one knows what, and if you try and figure it out, you go crazy, and that's like ancient magical secrets that people are not meant to access except for her. And the Githzerai are space monks. If the Githyanki are space pirates, then the Githzerai are space monks. They live in citadels that they can teleport at will in the plane of limbo, and their leader is a full-bodied, fully paralyzed individual who is so psychically powerful that he makes Professor Xavier look like 11 from Stranger Things. He could twitch his eyelid and you would die from a psychic overload attack. Now, Githzerai and Githyanki, because the Githzerai blame the Githyanki for what happened to the founder of the Gith race, at the very start of their society, they were slaves to the Mind Flayers too. And they didn't like that too much. And then they rebelled against the Mind Flayers. And then they called for a holy war against the Mind Flayers, which means that no matter how deep the divide between Githzerai and Githyanki are, and it is a significant divide, they will always put aside their differences if it means to go kill a Mind Flayer. Because Mind Flayers are the enemy, and Mind Flayers must die. But after that long tangent, and after the party had previously killed some intellect devourers of the Mind Flayers. And Mind Flayers have the ability to essentially levitate at will, as they are psionic individuals, and they took exception to a denial of prey. So a couple of Mind Flayers, as the party was on their boat during a rest, because I always love to attack my party during the rest, because it lures them into a false sense of security, a group of Illithids, I believe it was 2 or 3 at the time, managed to attack the party and nearly critically injured many of them, until one of them got their tentacles wrapped around Mallos's tiefling horns and then squeezed, and Mallos's brain was cracked out of his skull like a Cadbury egg. Mallos didn't make it, although Azrael was very quick to cut out the brain. The brain had already been subject to the bile and acid of the Mind Flayers, because Mind Flayers eat brains. Though they attempted to put the brain back into Mallos's body and were successful in a revivify, Mallos didn't make it. Now, typically, this would be the end of the story, but because also, admittedly, I didn't really want to go through another reworking with a character of Danny at that time. I'll happily do it now, Danny, as I'm sure you're listening to this in the future. If you ever want to rework another player character class construct. But because I knew that they had the tools, and I didn't want my party to feel too depressed, because I am a very sadistic dungeon master, but I'm not completely heartless. At least I don't believe I am. The party was informed that although the restored Mallos was indeed relatively brain dead, he was essentially under the effects of a Feeble Mind spell, which the party did not have the means to reverse, and something that had been done magically before that they could reverse, because it happened to Criella as they were escaping the Dark Dwarf, the Kotoa city. Mallos was a different case, because that was the case of just magical brain damage. This was your brain just got ripped out and we put it back in your skull, and now we are trying to bring you back. But thankfully, if you've been reading along with the slides, the party had a Ring of Regeneration, which with a little bit of rules fumbling, Mallos managed to attune to it, and neuron by neuron managed to reconstruct his brain back to the way that it was. Now, the hilarious thing about this is, technically, as rules written, he would have been mentally capable, because he never unattuned to the Headband of Intellect. That being said, the Headband of Intellect, while it sets your intelligence score to 19, which would cure the intelligence of 1 that the creature would have after being in a sort of pseudo-feeble mind, Mallos would have a 1 charisma. And as a sorcerer, he kind of needs charisma in order to do anything. So the party, after a sense of relief washed over them that Mallos managed to come out on the other side of this instance of death relatively unharmed, thanks to the Ring of Regeneration, and just because I like seeing my characters, I like seeing my players have those moments of happiness to make the moments of tragedy and sadness all the more poignant. it was one of those instances in our story that Mallos really, really was the brains of the operation until he lost his mind. However, all puns aside, the party was eventually restored to a hale and hearty state. I believe near this part of the story, they were about level 7 to level 8-ish, which is always a fun level because in 5e, there are various levels where you have the ability to increase your stats or to gain new feats, and some of the feats that the party went through managed to significantly increase their general capabilities. One of the best examples of this is Criella, who is a very competent telekinetic. She took the telekinetic feat, I believe, at level 4, if not level 8, which, since she already had the Mage Hand cantrip, gave her a 60-foot reach telekinetically that's also invisible, which, when your telekinesis is invisible, it's a lot more handy. And it also means that if something fell into the waters of the Dark Lake, you don't actually have to go in yourself. And with all this madness that was going on, there was also quite a bit of, for lack of a better word, dream intervention that was happening towards the members of the party. Ellie, around this point, had taken what was known as the Magic Initiate feat, which she took for the purposes of getting a bit of magic for extra damage and utility. And the damage that she took initially drew the attention of another of the Demon Lords, a Demon Lord of Undeath, known as Orcus, which Ellie was not very comfortable with. But eventually, Ellie managed to find a connection to Orcus's divine antithesis, which any member of Critical Role will know is the very mysterious deity in 5e who has recently come to popularity, possibly because of Critical Role, the Raven Queen, a mistress of death herself, who, in her infinite folds of feathers, took Ellie under her wing, and Ellie eventually, after level 8, chose the path of a Hexblade Warlock, devoting herself to the protection and service of the ideals of the Raven Queen. Azrael had several dreams where he found himself in a entirely black mindscape that was only altered by the presence of a campfire and a couple of logs, where a strange, almost shadowy-like being that shared his eyes but was completely engulfed in shadow instead, completely engulfed in shadow, rather like the drapes of a mummy, spoke to him very kindly. Azrael would come up and question who it is, and he would be answered with, "Oh, hey, buddy. Just hanging out by the fire." Azrael eventually would come to realize that who this is, and his joke name is Zach, a first-class soldier. That is actually his angelic protector, who, due to his training as a Dark Knight, he purposefully not stained, but shifted his soul from that of light to shadow not necessarily darkness, which was the reason that his angelic protector had the imagery that he did. And his protector would always tell him, as far as I'm concerned, this is your path. I'm just along for the ride. And that was a very interesting dynamic, as it's one of the most intimate relationships that you can have as a dungeon master via a player character, when there is a being that shares the skin/fate of the player character. And you can't really get that from a lot of instances. The most that typically come are from the SMR race, as they are 1/1 billionth. Like, it's a ridiculously small percentage. Bit divine, or similar other hive-like entities such as the Kalashtar and other beings of that nature. Mallos, in particular, had a dream of meeting Ayun, his protector goddess, who he had been raised under but didn't necessarily it was more of an acknowledgement of her presence rather than a projected belief towards her. But as he sought more knowledge in terms of the situation, and as he looked for aid in whatever form that it could be, that cry for assistance eventually came to her knowing ears, and she brought him bit by bit into her love and affection. And every instance of that, Mallos has come out of the other side of that long rest a little bit happier and a little bit more confident. And that's one of the things that you love to see as a dungeon master, when your players start to feel like they can really take on the world with the characters that they've built. Criella would also have some dreamlike instances. However, those, while significantly important, will have to wait for future episodes. As the Breakfast Club arrived after their 20-day-long expedition over to the Deep Dwarf City, they were really glad to be off that fucking boat. It's not necessarily like Berserk standards, which some of you anime/manga readers might understand that reference. But they were on that boat for a significant period of time, and their arrival was tumultuous, to say the least. They were only in Graxland for about 1 to 2 days before events led to them quickly running away from said city without exploring them. To the point where, in that chapter, it's supposed to be, as written by Wizards of the Coast, you go from Vecnavelv to the Koatoa City, to the Dark Dwarf City, to the Neverlight Grove, and then to Blingdenstone. And that's about the first half of the book. Your players are supposed to be level 8 or 9 by the time you leave the Dark, but by the time you leave the Underdark. They were a little bit higher level than that, but to compensate for combat purposes, I threw bigger and bigger stuff at them. But as they arrived at the Deep Dwarf City, at the Dark Dwarf, not Deep Dwarf, Dark Dwarf City, they managed to find that the section of the city that they were allowed into, which was known as the Dark Lake District, very creative name, it was your typical sort of seedy, very probably someone will shank you if you go into these alleyways kind of dwarvish evil city that one would expect from a society of slaver forgers. But as stated, they were not in the Deep Dwarf City for long. They didn't explore significantly. They went to a couple of brothels and they went to a couple of inns before one of them began to, I believe it was Roscoe and Azrael, who started getting attacked by a daughter of their benefactor, Saria Darialis. The daughter would identify herself as Ruto, I believe. And the reason she was explaining her attack was because her mother was trying to push them towards the meeting, and they felt as though the pit stop at the Deep Dwarf City shouldn't take as long as it should be, which was probably one of the factors for how short their initial trip to the Dark Dwarf City was. And yes, I know it says deep on there, and it is very distracting reading that. That's probably my own brainlessness. I'm not going to apologize, though. But the second instance was entirely led by Criella and Mallos, as I think Criella was kind of dragged into this, but she had been developing a rapport with Griselia, which was an interesting thing to roleplay-wise, for a couple of factors, and a couple of factors that we'll get into later. For lack of a better word, the RTDFW group has always had the ability to get randy at certain times, which can translate into 5e settings. And that rambunctiousness can develop with the interpersonal characters of our role-played characters. Now, Mallos was approaching it as, first, his interest had been piqued since he got psychically kicked out of Griselia's head, but as a man of intellect, he also wanted to see just what the crap was going on. So they took Griselia to a priest of Bahamut who had a small residence in the Dark Lake district. It was a rather elderly dragonborn, and when they met the dragonborn, after a brief conversation in Draconic, the dragonborn used a different type of identify that Mallos and the rest of the party didn't have access to try and figure out who this woman was and what the runic seal on her back was. As he looked at it, he turned to Mallos and Criella and said, "What have you brought into my chapel? This creature is..." And as he was about to say what the creature was, the runic symbol on Griselia's back flashed, and a beam struck the priest that instantly disintegrated the priest. Horrified by what they had done, Griselia and Mallos and Criella all ran back to the rest of the party and said, "Well, we gotta go. We just killed a priest." Although I don't believe they said that they killed a priest until they were well within further distance from the Dark Dwarf City. That being said, there is nothing that every party loves to hear, rather that after a 20 in-game day boat trip, that, hey, we need to get back on the boat and leave, because it was another 12 days over to the Neverlight Grove, which was a significant blow of morale for the rest of the party. But they they forsook the exploration of the city, and they did manage to make a safe escape back towards the home of Stool, which they had been taking the little tyke this entire time, and they did want to get him home safely as at least one goal accomplished while all the rest of this stuff was going on. However, this just raised even further questions about who Griselia actually was and what this mysterious seal was that was driving such a pivotal force upon this party, which If you're still listening, I thank you for doing so, but we will get into next time as the Breakfast Club makes their way into the Neverlight Grove, a world of fungus and ethereal delights and spectacles that also have some revelations about the party and another light lost. But until then, this has been David, your demonic dungeon master, and as always, don't be afraid of the dark.